Number 1. Robert Menendez. The courtroom was completely still, as if holding its breath. No noise. No trace of power or prestige. Just one man with gray hair, standing quietly before the judge. Robert Menendez. Former U.S. Senator from New Jersey, once a name that carried weight across Washington. That day, he was no longer the one making decisions. He was the one waiting for a verdict. When the judge announced an 11-year prison sentence, there was no anger. No explanation.
And
Only
I
a
look
hollow
forward
stare, as if he were
to
reflecting on his
filing
entire
appeals
life
on
in
a
that
whole
moment.
host
Power
of
once
issues.
lifted him to extraordinary heights. But that same power also led to his fall. And now, a silent question seems to echo in
Hope
his mind.
President Trump
And in
cleans up the
ours, is
cesspool
power ever
and
truly
restores the
untouchable?
integrity
Robert
to the
Menendez
system.
did not enter politics by chance. His rise was built on years of persistence-long campaigns, exhausting efforts, and a belief that politics could truly change people's lives. For many years, he was the image of a powerful senator. Composed speeches. Confident steps through the halls where decisions carry historical weight. He was used to being heard. Used to the feeling that every word he spoke could open doors or close them. Power slowly became routine. Confidence turned into the belief that everything was still under control. Menendez believed he understood the rules, knew the limits, and was smart enough to never cross a dangerous line. But that very confidence, quiet and self-assured, led him to believe he could not fall. That experience, status, and political influence would always serve as a shield against mistakes. And that is where people begin to confuse the power they hold with the power they truly control. The meetings began to happen behind closed doors. No records, no written notes, just slow handshakes and unspoken understanding. No one called it bribery, they called it trust, relationships, goodwill between people with influence. Then the gifts appeared, quietly, without attention. Cash exchanged hands quickly. Gold bars rested in silence, heavy and unseen. A luxury car, presented as a reward for timely assistance. Each gift came with a gentle explanation, a simple thank you, no obligations, no expectations. And Menendez believed it. Or at least, he chose to. Moral boundaries do not disappear all at once. They wear down gradually with every acceptance, every reassurance that everything is still under control. Until silence becomes an agreement, and conscience grows accustomed to looking away. Robert Menendez's influence did not stop at private meetings. It began to extend beyond personal dealings, reaching interests that were larger and far more complex. Business figures did not come to him simply for advice. They needed intervention, a voice strong enough to shift outcomes. And Menendez had grown accustomed to being that voice. Then the relationships expanded not only within the country, but beyond its borders. Egypt, Qatar, names well known on the international political stage. In that arena, every decision carries strategic weight, and every action can alter the balance of power. The influence of a U.S. senator became something that could be exchanged subtle, polished, and dangerous. Menendez did not see it as betrayal. He told himself he was practicing politics, negotiating, using influence to secure beneficial outcomes. But when national power is weighed and traded, when the interests of the United States are placed beside silent gifts, the line between diplomacy and compromise begins to blur. And in that uncertainty, it becomes easy to take one step too far, then another, without realizing how far you've gone. Behind the speeches and public spotlight, Robert Menendez returned home like any other man. There was no power there, no privilege. Only family and eyes hoping for a sense of peace. But the secrets followed him through that door, quietly and heavily. Money no longer stayed confined to private meetings. It seeped into personal life, into the silent spaces within the household. The quiet felt different. Questions went unanswered. Emotions were carefully hidden to protect an outward image. The politician, who once spoke with confidence before crowds, found himself uncertain in front of the people closest to him. The greatest tragedy did not lie in the sentence that would come later, but in the moment of realization. Every choice he made did not only risk his career, it placed a burden on those who never had the chance to choose. And when power enters a family, it does not bring glory. It leaves fractures, ones that are not easily repaired. The courtroom grew heavy as the prosecutor began reading the charges. Each sentence, each word, was clear and detached, delivered without emotion. What had once been described as gifts was now called by its proper names: cash, gold bars, luxury vehicles. Each piece of evidence was presented like a puzzle piece, quietly closing the final path of denial. Robert Menendez stood there, listening to his own story told through someone else's voice. There was no explanation gentle enough, no argument strong enough to undo what had been revealed. What had been hidden in the shadows now stood fully exposed under the light of accountability. He understood that this moment was inevitable. He had only believed it would come later. When the judge announced an 11-year prison sentence, the room fell completely silent. Menendez did not turn to search for familiar faces. He simply stood still and exhaled softly, like someone finally setting down a burden carried for far too long. Power once gave him everything. Now, it left only a sentence and a truth that could not be undone. Robert Menendez's story may have ended in a courtroom, but its impact does not stop there. Because this is not only the downfall of a politician, it is the cost of power when someone believes they stand above all limits. Power does not turn people into something they are not. It simply reveals what has existed deep within all along. The law may move slowly, but it never sleeps. It watches quietly, remembers every small choice, every moment when someone allows themselves to cross a line. And one day, influence fades. Connections lose their strength. No title remains enough to offer protection. Before justice, every label is stripped away, leaving only the individual and the choices they made. Robert Menendez once believed power would protect him. In the end, the law proved more enduring than any position ever could. His story leaves behind a quiet but bitter reminder. When people place their faith in power over conscience, collapse is no longer a question of if only when. Number 2, Rod Blagojevich. The courtroom that day was not loud, but the air felt heavy, almost difficult to breathe. Rod Blagojevich stood in silence. His thick hair, once a symbol of confidence, now seemed to weigh on him. He was the former governor of Illinois, a man who once held enough power to shape the political future of an entire state. And now, he was waiting to hear a 14-year prison sentence. Rod Blagojevich was never a forgettable politician. He was articulate, comfortable in front of the camera, and deeply convinced he was meant to lead. To many, he embodied a certain version of the American ambition: young, sharp, energetic, and unafraid to put himself at the center of attention. Power came to him early, and it stayed long enough to feel inevitable. When Barack Obama was elected president, a U.S. Senate seat was suddenly left vacant. For Blagojevich, it was more than a political position. It was an opportunity one he believed he had the right to control. In his mind, that seat was not simply a public responsibility. It was leverage, a bargaining chip that could be exchanged for money or a high-paying position in his own future. Private conversations began to take place behind closed doors. No paperwork, no formal agreements, just words, hints, statements that sounded casual, even joking, but were carefully calculated. Blagojevich did not believe he was committing a crime. He believed he was playing a political game, and in that game, he was convinced he was smarter than the law. He talked too much, spoke to people who should never have heard those words, spoke in moments when he believed he was safe, and every word would later become evidence. When the recordings were made public, the nation was stunned, not by sophistication, but by how openly it was said. A U.S. Senate seat, a symbol of democracy, was discussed as if it were something to be negotiated. Behind the image of an arrogant politician, Blagojevich was also a husband and a father. But ambition overwhelmed every boundary. His family was pulled into a storm they did not create. From quiet evenings, they were thrust into a world of media attention, investigations, and judgment. The power Blagojevich once took pride in had now become a weight carried by everyone around him. In court, the prosecutor called everything by its proper name. No longer strategy, no longer negotiation. It was a scheme to trade a public office for personal gain. Blagojevich listened, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes remaining silent. Somewhere inside, he still believed he had been misunderstood, that this was simply how politics worked, that this time it had only been exposed. When the judge announced a 14-year prison sentence, the room fell silent. Rod Blagojevich stood there, no longer a governor, no longer a player in the game of power, just a man facing the consequences of believing he could control everything. Rod Blagojevich's story is not only about corruption, it is about illusion. The illusion that power allows someone to place a price on everything, even the trust of society. But the law does not operate on illusion. It is patient, quiet, and when the time comes, it appears to remind us. Power can make people believe they are exceptional, but before justice, no one is an exception. And when the seat of power is taken away, what remains is the truth, that no position is high enough to stand above the law, and no ambition is great enough to justify trading away one's conscience. Number 3. Duke Cunningham. Duke Cunningham was once a war hero, a pilot who returned from the skies of conflict carrying medals, honor, and the respect of the public. When he entered Congress, he did not simply represent California. He represented the image of patriotism, discipline, strength, and unwavering resolve. For many years, Duke Cunningham was a prominent voice on defense issues. He understood the military, he understood conflict, and he understood one critical truth: defense budgets are where power and money intersect. At first, it was only familiar connections. Contractors came seeking advice, support, and guidance. Cunningham saw it as normal, as part of the job, as the responsibility of an experienced lawmaker. But then, things began to change. Not overnight, but gradually. Private dinners, carefully arranged trips, money appearing more openly with time, and Cunningham stopped hiding it. He created a price list, clear, specific. Every request came with a number. Every intervention had its own fee. What had once been discreet became routine. At least $2.4 million passed through his hands from defense contractors. In return came contracts, preferential treatment, decisions that directly affected taxpayer money and national security. Cunningham no longer questioned right or wrong. He calculated value. Not whether it was justified, but whether the price was high enough. In Washington, he remained a confident congressman. He continued to speak about patriotism. He continued to talk about responsibility to the nation. But behind closed doors, everything had changed. When someone becomes accustomed to selling power, conscience does not disappear all at once. It slowly falls silent, and that silence is dangerous. In the end, the very system he believed he understood so well turned its attention directly toward him. The investigation began. The numbers were no longer hidden. The price list no longer stayed in the shadows. The public was stunned not only by the amount of money, but by how openly it had been done. A man once seen as a symbol had turned public power into something openly priced. At the 2006 trial, Duke Cunningham no longer carried the image of a hero. He stood before the court as a defendant. When the sentence of 8 years and 4 months in prison was announced, there were no grand defenses, only a late acknowledgement that everything had gone too far. Duke Cunningham's story is not only about corruption, it is a lesson in repetition. When people repeat a wrongdoing long enough, they begin to believe it is the new order. That the law is distant, that consequences belong to someone else. But justice does not need noise. It only needs time. Power, when not restrained by ethics, becomes something that can be traded. And once power is given a price, the moment of its collapse has already been set long before it happens. Number 4. Ray Nagin. When Hurricane Katrina swept through New Orleans, the city lost more than homes. It lost its sense of direction. Flooded streets, shattered neighborhoods, people in shock. And in the middle of that devastation, Ray Nagin emerged as a symbol of hope. He was the mayor, the man expected to lead the city back from disaster. In those darkest days, Ray Nagin spoke about rebuilding, about the future, about responsibility to the people. He stood before cameras with a firm expression, calling for trust and patience. Millions believed him. Because in times of crisis, people need a face to hold on to. But behind the emotional speeches, a different New Orleans was being negotiated in silence. Contractors came forward. They brought promises to help the city recover faster. And with those promises came privileges. Cash, luxury trips, discreetly arranged services presented as if they were simply personal gestures. Ray Nagin did not see it as wrongdoing. He convinced himself it was fair compensation for the pressure and responsibility he carried, that the city needed rebuilding, and that he needed people willing to move quickly. But with every profitable contract signed, with every personal benefit accepted, the line between serving the public and serving oneself began to fade. While residents struggled to recover from their losses, power was being exchanged behind closed doors. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moved through familiar connections. Luxury trips took place while the city was still trying to mend wounds that had not yet healed. And trust, the most fragile thing, after a disaster, slowly eroded, unnoticed. When the investigation began, the image of a leader guiding a city through crisis collapsed quickly. What had once been described as assistance was now called by its proper name: bribes, personal gain, abuse of authority at a moment when the public was most vulnerable. Ray Nagin was forced to face a difficult truth. The disaster did not come only from nature, but also from human choices. In 2014, a 10-year prison sentence was handed down. Ray Nagin stood before the court, no longer the mayor of rebuilding, but a man who had betrayed the role entrusted to him. The courtroom was silent. No chants, no calls for unity, only consequences. Ray Nagin's story stands as a bitter warning. In the darkest moments, power is not only a tool for leadership, it is a test of character. When personal gain is placed above collective suffering, the collapse does not belong to one individual alone. It leaves a lasting scar on an entire city. Number 5. William Jefferson. William Jefferson was once a well-educated congressman, soft-spoken, composed, and always presenting a polished image. He represented Louisiana, carrying the reputation of a lawmaker focused on economic development and global opportunity. For years, he spoke about the future, about international cooperation, about projects designed to create mutual benefit. Africa appeared often in Jefferson's speeches as a land of promise. He talked about investment, about potential, about connecting American businesses with emerging markets. But behind those forward-looking words, the negotiations began to take on a different tone. They were no longer purely about policy. They became about advantage, about money exchanged for timely influence. The meetings took place quietly. Promises were made softly, as if they were nothing more than routine assistance. Jefferson believed he was facilitating business, that the money he accepted was simply a cost of convenience. But with every acceptance, every moment he chose to look the other way, the line between serving the public and serving himself grew increasingly blurred. Then the case took an unexpected turn. When FBI agents searched William Jefferson's home, they did not uncover sophisticated secret accounts. They found cash, $90,000, carefully wrapped, hidden inside a freezer. A cold, silent place, much like the way he had tried to keep that secret away from the light. That moment sent shockwaves through the public. Not only because of the amount of money, but because of the contrast. A politician who spoke about global cooperation had hidden illicit cash in the most private corner of his home. That image became a symbol of collapsed trust. No dramatic accusations were needed. All it took was opening a freezer door. At the 2009 trial, William Jefferson faced the reality of his actions. The payments were called by their proper name. The projects in Africa were no longer vision, they were pretexts. When a 13-year prison sentence was handed down, there was no surprise. Only the late realization of someone who had gone too far, yet still believed he could keep everything under control. William Jefferson's story is not loud, but it lingers. It shows that corruption does not always wear a grand disguise. Sometimes, it sits quietly in the most ordinary places. And when power is used in exchange for personal gain, the truth will surface sooner or later, cold, clear, and impossible to hide. Number 6. Albert Fall. Albert Fall was not a loud politician. He came from a different era, one where power was exercised quietly, through agreements made behind firmly closed doors. As U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall controlled land, natural resources, and decisions that could directly affect national security. In the 1920s, America entered the age of industry and energy. Oil became the lifeblood of power. And in Albert Fall's hands, the Navy's oil reserves, including Teapot Dome, were no longer just national assets. They became leverage, opportunities for quiet exchange. There was no public bidding, no transparent competition. Fall allowed private oil companies to access these strategic reserves through quiet agreements. In return, he received payments disguised as loans, gifts, or personal favors. In his world, everything could be arranged as long as it remained discreet. Albert Fall did not see himself as greedy. He believed he was using his authority to create mutual benefit, that the companies would operate more efficiently, that he deserved compensation for his role and influence. But in that quiet confidence, Fall traded away something far greater: the public's trust in its government. The Teapot Dome scandal slowly came into the open. Layer by layer, the secrecy was peeled away. What had been described as loans were no longer loans. What had been framed as administrative decisions were no longer routine. The American public was stunned not by the amount of money, but by something far more significant. For the first time, a member of the U.S. cabinet was exposed as someone who had accepted improper payments. In 1929, Albert Fall was sentenced to 1 year in prison. The sentence itself was not long, but its impact was enormous. Albert Fall became the first cabinet member in U.S. history to go to prison. An unprecedented moment, a deep fracture in the image of power that had long been considered untouchable. There was no dramatic scene, no loud defense, only an aging man facing the truth that power, no matter how carefully hidden, cannot stand outside justice forever. Albert Fall's story is not just a historic corruption case. It is the earliest warning that when national resources are traded in the shadows, collapse becomes only a matter of time. And that the law, however slow it may seem, is patient enough to wait for the right moment. Albert Fall set a painful precedent for the United States. Not because he was the first to make such a mistake, but because he was the first to prove that even those at the highest levels of power cannot escape the cost of a wrong choice. Number 7. George Ryan. George Ryan was once seen as a moderate politician. Quiet, unassuming. He served as governor of Illinois, a man more familiar with administrative processes than with aggressive power struggles. To many, Ryan represented stability, a system manager, not someone seeking the spotlight. But it is often in the most routine places that power is most easily underestimated. While overseeing the commercial driver's license system, George Ryan faced decisions few people paid attention to: who received a license, who was denied. On paper, these were simple administrative steps. In reality, they determined who was allowed to operate massive vehicles on public roads. Then the gifts began to appear. Small, quiet, cash a trip, a minor favor in exchange for an easy signature. Ryan did not see it as dangerous. He told himself he was being flexible, that the system was complicated, and people deserved understanding. But each concession opened a path that became harder to turn away from. Commercial driver's licenses were issued to individuals who were not fully qualified, lacking proper training, lacking sufficient experience. And out on the highways, the consequences began to surface: serious accidents, lives lost, tragedies that had nothing to do with George Ryan's office on the surface, yet traced back to decisions once thought harmless. The scandal came to be known by a cold, clinical name: licenses for cash. As the investigation unfolded, every gift, every trip, every payment was laid out in plain view. It was no longer flexibility, no longer an exception. It was a system of exchange, sustained by authority and silence. 2006 trial. George Ryan was no longer the calm governor. He was a defendant. When a sentence of 6 years and 6 months in prison was announced, the room fell quiet. Not because of the number, but because of the realization administrative misconduct, when combined with power, can take lives without a single shot being fired. George Ryan's story is not about massive bribes. It delivers a far more unsettling warning: that sometimes, abuse of power does not come from grand ambition, but from prolonged complacency. And when people grow accustomed to treating responsibility lightly, the consequences do not stop with them. Administrative power, even when quiet, carries the weight of human lives. And when it is traded for personal benefit, the cost is not only a prison sentence but trust and lives that can never be restored. Number 8. Buddy Science. Buddy Science was a very different kind of mayor. He did not simply run the city of Providence. He dominated it. For many years, the name Buddy Science was synonymous with absolute power at City Hall in Rhode Island. He appeared forceful, decisive, and confident, as if the city itself moved to his rhythm. To many residents, Science represented order. A man who knew how to get things done. Someone who could make problems disappear quickly. But that efficiency concealed a system operating in the shadows. In Providence, there was more than policy. There were unwritten rules. If you wanted a contract, if you wanted a job, if you wanted special treatment. First, you had to take a different path. Bribery was no longer an exception. It became procedure. A tightly organized system where power was distributed like a network. At City Hall, every decision had a price. Every signature, every contract. Every public position paid for with money, favors, or loyalty. Buddy Science was not outside that system. He was at its center. The most dangerous part was not the amount of money. It was normalization. When corruption lasts long enough, it no longer shocks. It becomes routine. The city began to function as if this were the only way things could move forward. And in that familiarity, the line between leadership and manipulation slowly disappeared. Science believed he was in control, that the system kept Providence stable, that no one was truly being harmed. But the law does not judge surface stability. It examines structure. And when the federal investigation began, each connection was pulled into the open. This was not a single violation. It was an organization, a full network of corruption. The charges were called by their proper name. Racketeering under the RICO statute, a term usually associated with the criminal underworld, was now attached to City Hall itself. Buddy Science, once seen as the embodiment of local power, became a defendant inside the very system he had built. In 2002, a 5-year prison sentence was handed down. No spectacle, no drama. But it was enough to close an era. Science was no longer mayor, no longer the man deciding the city's fate. Just an individual facing the consequences of turning public power into a personal tool. Buddy Science's story reveals something deeply unsettling. Corruption does not always begin with massive greed. It begins with unchecked control, and when power remains concentrated in one set of hands for too long, the system slowly shifts, serving the individual instead of the community. Local power may be smaller than national power, but when it is manipulated in an organized way, the damage it leaves behind is anything but small. It erodes trust, it distorts entire systems. And when justice finally arrives, what it dismantles is not only one individual, but the illusion that familiar power can somehow exist outside the law. Number 9. James Traficant. James Traficant was unlike most politicians. He spoke loudly, bluntly, and never hid his ego. As a U.S. representative from Ohio, Traficant built an image of himself as a defiant outsider, someone who believed he did not belong to the very system he operated within. To many voters, he was a rebellious voice, a man willing to challenge traditional power. But behind that bold exterior was someone accustomed to giving orders. For Traficant, power was not just about policy or voting. It was about control. He accepted improper payments. He avoided taxes. And more troubling still, he required staff members under his authority to perform personal tasks at his private farm. Work unrelated to public service carried out through pressure and dependence. In Traficant's world, the line between authority and privilege almost disappeared. He believed loyalty from subordinates was automatic. That power entitled him to demand more than the law allowed. And when people grow accustomed to treating others as tools, they often lose sight of what they are abusing. These actions did not happen in a single reckless moment. They unfolded over time, repeated, reinforced, until they became a way of thinking. His private farm was not just a place to live. It became a symbol of personal power built on the labor of others. And in the silence of those who felt pressured, Traficant believed he was still untouchable. The investigation eventually arrived. Undeclared money, testimony from staff members, actions exposed in ways that could no longer be denied. The image of an anti-establishment hero collapsed quickly, revealing someone who had used public power for personal benefit in the most direct way. In 2002, James Traficant was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Inside the courtroom, there were no loud speeches. No defiance. Only a man facing the consequences of believing he was different, that the law did not apply to him as it did to everyone else. James Traficant's story is a bitter reminder. Power does not only corrupt policy, it can distort how people treat one another. When subordinates are seen as property, when public responsibility becomes personal privilege, collapse becomes only a matter of time. And in the end, no matter how big the personality, no matter how loud the voice, before justice, everyone stands in the same place. No one can speak louder than the truth. Number 10. Robert P. Burke. Robert P. Burke devoted his entire life to the United States Navy. From his earliest days in uniform to the rank of admiral, he was trained to believe in discipline, honor, and absolute loyalty to the nation. To many, Burke was more than a senior officer. He was a symbol of order, of the belief that the military stood apart from the murkier worlds of politics and money. But power does not exist only in civilian boardrooms. At the highest levels of the armed forces, it takes a different form. The power to influence contracts, the power to allocate budgets, the power to decide who receives opportunity and who is pushed aside. As Robert P. Burke approached retirement, that power was still firmly in his hands. And life after the uniform was no longer a distant idea, but a very real question. A technology training company entered the picture. Quietly, deliberately, they spoke about partnership, about modernization, about long-term benefits for the Navy. And alongside those professional discussions, another promise was placed on the table: a post-retirement position, a salary of $500,000 a year, no paperwork, just an understanding. Robert P. Burke did not see it as betrayal. He convinced himself this was a continuation of his career, that a lifetime of service and experience deserved a high reward. But at the same time, multi-million-dollar Navy contracts were being awarded. Not to those best qualified, but because of a quiet agreement behind the scenes. The most dangerous part was not the money. It was the timing. Burke was no longer a young officer. He was a man who had nearly completed a lifetime defined by honor. And it was at that final stretch that one wrong choice shook everything he had once represented. When the line between serving the nation and preparing for personal gain begins to blur, the honor of the military itself is pulled into the storm. In May 2025, the truth came to light. Backroom agreements were no longer speculation. Promises of future employment were no longer distant possibilities. Robert P. Burke was found guilty of accepting bribes. And for the first time, a U.S. Navy admiral faced the possibility of up to 30 years in prison. Inside the courtroom, there was no uniform, no medals, no ceremony. Only a man facing a question he had avoided for most of his life: can honor, built over decades, be destroyed by a single final agreement? Robert P. Burke's story is not just a case of corruption. It is a tragedy of endings. Of the moment when personal future begins to outweigh the mission once sworn to protect. And when power is traded for tomorrow, the cost can erase everything from the past. Honor is not lost in war. It is lost in the quiet moments when someone believes no one is watching anymore.